going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. We have a lot of unique stats at PFF, and one of my favorites for wide receivers is yards per route run. It's a very easy way to gauge how efficient these guys are on a per route basis. And you know what? The more efficient you are, the more effective you can be for fantasy purposes. So yards per route run, it's definitely a secret fantasy weapon. Now, when we look at this, let's take a look at last year's top 10. And I'm going to tell you this flat out. If you want to make sense of these numbers, what does it mean? Again, it's how effective they are, so how many yards per route they're accumulating on the season. But if you see a player at or near 3.0, 3 yards per route run, that is elite. Historically elite. Now, last year we'll see that nobody did that, right? But the guy at the top with 2.93, Julio Jones, he has done that before. In fact, multiple times. Julio Jones annually is one of the most efficient receivers on a per route basis. And I know for fantasy purposes, people want to hate on him. The guy had 8 receiving touchdowns last year, by the way, which is still a rock solid number. He's certainly a favorite to be, the top of this list again this year. You got to love Julio Jones just from the efficiency standpoint. He's an elite fantasy receiver. We know that, of course. And then you look to the guy at number 2, Michael Thomas, who's coming off a 125 catch season at 2.66 yards per route run. So efficient. Now, the thing about Thomas that sort of separates him maybe from the absolute top of my wide receiver rankings is I don't think his ceiling is as high. His average depth of target's a little bit lower than what we see among the other elite fantasy receivers. But that's not a huge knock on him because he has the highest floor at the position. He is so good and he's so efficient on a per route basis. Some of the other names you see in the top 10, you see some of these big play guys, right? So the efficiency may be different for these players. With Julio, with Michael Thomas, it's consistency. With T.Y. Hilton, with Tyreek Hill, it isn't as much consistency. We know that on a week in, week out basis. With Tyreek Hill, you could have him finish as the number 1 fantasy receiver. In fact, he did so multiple times last year in any given week. But he could also finish outside of the top 30 as well in any given week, and he did so multiple times last year. So keep in mind that while they may be efficient on a per route basis, that efficiency comes in different chunks for some of these players. Some interesting names who also topped or cracked the top 10 here that I have to point out. Look down to the bottom there of the top 10. DeSean Jackson, very interesting at 2.27. Now, that was the big complaint, though, last year was DeSean, him and Jameis just aren't on the same page, and that's why DeSean really wasn't able to put up viable fantasy numbers there. Well, he was very efficient on a per route basis, so that bodes well. He is no longer paired up with Jameis Winston, right? He's now with Carson Wentz back in Philadelphia, and he's in a position where he could hit the ground running as the number 2 wideout in that offense. Now, keep in mind, the number 2 wideout is very likely going to be the number 3 target because we know Zach Ertz is going to get his. But DeSean Jackson has some sneaky appeal in the later rounds as a deep receiver you want to look at. He has this efficiency. I think that's going to continue here in Philadelphia. So that's good for him. And then, of course, Cooper Kupp. Now, we didn't get a full season out of Cooper Kupp last year, but one of the more efficient wideouts over the stretch that he was at least on the field. And I think that makes a lot of sense given his role in that offense. Now, Kupp is going to be the 3rd receiver drafted out of the Rams receivers, the trio of Cooks and Woods and Kupp this year. He may end up being the best value as a result. Now, it's not like he's going way after Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks. They're all going within 12 to 15 picks of each other. But if you get Kupp in the 5th round, there's a lot to like there. We know the PPR floor is relatively high with him given his role in the offense, and he is very efficient on a per route basis. So all of that bodes well for Cooper Kupp's production heading in to 2019. Now, some guys who didn't make the list here and guys who are potentially, a lot further down, I have to throw out Larry Fitzgerald's name. As I said, you want to be at or around, if you're at 3.0, you're elite, but at or around 2.2, that cracks the top 10. Those guys are some of the best in the league. Larry Fitzgerald was at 1.38 last year. Now, to be fair, the quarterback situation didn't do him many favors, but in the same right, Christian Kirk was at 1.72. So Larry Fitzgerald, obviously, he ran a lot of routes last year. He has the potential to run a lot of routes again this year, but the efficiency declining there in a situation where, you can compare apples to apples in the same offense with Christian Kirk, it just shows us that, hey, Larry Fitz, a fantasy great, an all-time great for fantasy purposes, no doubt about it. But at this point in his career, the ceiling is just so low that you may want to let somebody else draft him. Sterling Shepard, this one is interesting as well. So Odell Beckham Jr. was right below Cooper Kupp at 2.26. So he was right there with Cooper Kupp, basically just a hair behind at number 11. Sterling Shepard was at 1.45, so significantly behind Beckham. And we know Beckham's phenomenal, so that's not a huge shock. But a lot of the complaints were about Eli Manning in that offense, but Beckham still managed to be efficient with Eli Manning in that offense, whereas Shepard's numbers weren't necessarily the same. Now, I do like Shepard from a volume standpoint this year. He's in a position where, he has very minimal competition for targets. Yes, Golden Tate's there, but Shepard really seems like he's going to stand out, just his versatility to be able to play on the inside and outside as the number one target out of the wide receivers, but the efficiency number needs to come out. Now, I will say that this efficiency number, it's not like 1.45 is what he had last year, then that's what he's going to have this year. But typically we don't see that much fluctuation. Like I said, Julio has always been elite. We don't see that much fluctuation with him. So it's not to say that he can't be more efficient, but it is one of those things that did raise some alarms for me for Sterling Shepard. So keep that in mind with him. One other duo that I did want to point out here that didn't make the top 10 list, but does bear some comparison, especially because of how good they were last year and how closely they're being drafted, is Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. So in terms of who was more productive on a per route basis, take a guess, and then I'll tell you, out of those wide receivers, did you guess yet? All right, so here it goes. Adam Thielen was 2.10. Stephon Diggs was at 1.72. Now, Thielen was right below where you want to be, borderline elite territory. Diggs was a little bit lower. Now, part of the problem there was that Kirk Cousins wasn't pushing the ball downfield. His average depth of target was very close to the line of scrimmage. You can check out the average depth of target video for quarterbacks to hear more on that. But in the same right, they're in the same offense. They're, on the field together. You want to see the efficiency maybe go up a little bit for Stephon Diggs. So, they're going so close to each other in fantasy drafts. If you had your choice of the two, you lean Thielen. It's not a huge knock on Stephon Diggs, but it is an interesting little piece of data that separates the two for fantasy purposes. You want to check out the rest of the yards per route run data and more. You can get all of that over at PFF.com.